Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help you thrive as a cyber risk manager. On today's episode, your virtual Chief Information Security Officer is Kip Boyle, and your virtual Cybersecurity Counsel is Jake Bernstein. Visit them at cyberriskopportunities.com and focolaw.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today?
Hey, Jake. Today we're going to learn more about the effects of cyber attacks on corporate reputation and consumer confidence. And we're going to do that with the help of our friend and public relations expert, Casey Boggs, who joins us as a guest today. And Casey's the president of Reputation Us, which is based in Portland, Oregon. And he was a guest back on our October 1st, 2019 episode. And so, Casey, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
And Casey, I was on vacation the first time you were a guest, so I'm glad to be speaking with you now.
Great. Yeah, I wish I was on vacation, but we're here taking care of these malicious actors. So until then, we're going to be talking about it. So thank you, Jake. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I have to ask, is your company's name pronounced Reputation Us or Reputation US, or is that kind of intentional that it could be either?
It's a good point. Actually, there's even more to it, but the Reputation Us is all-inclusive, that we are representing companies. It's a collective effort here. Rep Us is the shorter pronunciation for the company, and it's really representing companies. And so it's a larger discussion, but the whole idea is reputation is an important part of corporations now more than ever. But it's a collective effort than just simply a community effort. It's an all-encompassing, all-department issue. Then we're here to help on enhancing reputations and protecting reputations.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. And so you guys recently conducted a cybersecurity and reputation survey. Can you go ahead and give us an overview of kind of what you did, what that means, and how it turned out?
Sure, my pleasure. So our firm, in addition to DHM Research, which DHM Research is based here in Portland as well, and they usually do political surveys and bipartisan surveys on public opinion. And so every month they look to different areas as far as things that are on top of people's mind. And one of them was a combination of reputation and cybersecurity. And so we proposed this survey with DHM, and coincidentally it was during Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is back in October, as you gentlemen probably both know, and really looked and examined the effects of cyber attacks on consumer confidence and really corporate reputation. And the study really was conducted back in September, but the results came out in October, and we surveyed 562 adults in Oregon, and those are the participants because of the confines that DHM had, and we wanted to make sure we kept it within a state for measurement purposes. But it was a pretty good pool of people and some really good, intriguing insights.
So, Casey, before we start understanding the results and the implications, I was curious to find out why would you conduct this survey now? Was it because you were focused on Cybersecurity Awareness Month, or was there something else driving this?
Yeah, there's no denying right now that cybersecurity is an imminent risk to corporations and disruption to business continuity. And there's our really potential large ramifications that businesses need to take serious, and damage to reputation and really loss of consumer confidence, and trying to capture their best interests is one of our number one priorities here, to find out really what's going on. And so combining and bridging the two together was our ultimate goal.
So, Casey, I'm dying to hear the bottom line. What would you say were the key results or key takeaways from the survey?
Well, I'm glad you asked. We were anxious to find out ourselves. And when we did receive it, one of the first things we saw that of those who participated, 73% had personal information compromised, which I don't know about you gentlemen, but certainly it was a higher number than I would thought. It's a question we want to make sure that are we talking to the right people, or the people are even affected by it, consumers or otherwise. And 73% is a vast majority of people certainly were affected.
Well, they were qualified to answer the questions, weren't they?
That's right, exactly. And so the other part where we want to get into the thick here is that it's mostly a question of who's to blame. If there is a cyber attack, who's to blame? And here's where I think the biggest aha moment was that of those participants, 54% said the hackers are to blame if a corporation gets hacked, while 46% say the corporation is. So almost a 50-50 split.
How interesting. So this is kind of a blame the victim sort of a perspective that some people had, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And it's, left to interpretation. But I would have thought, me personally, and this is just me jumping in here, but I would have thought, well, the hackers, they're the bad guys. They're the malicious actors out there.
Yeah.
I'm going to go after, they should be, ridiculed and taken care of and, taken out of society. But, that's not necessarily the case. They're like, wait a second, corporations are just as much on the hook about this as anyone else is. And I wouldn't have said that, maybe based on what I know and the world I live in within cybersecurity. But the consumers, which are ultimately the people on the street who are affected by it, they say otherwise. So I thought that was dynamic.
It actually kind of makes sense to me, because if you look at the terminology that we use around cyber, particularly cyber hygiene implies that there is a baseline level of risk that isn't, yes, there are humans involved and someone is at fault, but on a macro level, there is a baseline risk of infection, if you will. And if by saying this actually in some ways gives me a hope that people are starting to figure this out. Yeah, you could blame the hackers, but if you look at the existence of hackers as no different than germs exist, then what you really have to do is, whose fault is it if you get sick? You're going to blame the germ, or are you going to blame yourself for not washing your hands, not getting a flu shot, et cetera, et cetera? So I think this makes good sense. And honestly, as counterintuitive as it may seem, I would like to see the percentage blaming the quote victim to get higher, because I think that they are the ones responsible for keeping themselves clean and safe. And if we shift the blame to the actors, then I think that we can't control the actors at all, right? So we have to be able to. We really should focus on what we can control, and in this case, it is the corporations being hacked.
I'm going to throw a counterpoint in there just for a second. I'm seeing a lot of shame among companies that are being successfully cyber attacked, and I think they're feeling shamed because they don't want to be blamed for being a victim. But I think one of the practical and bad consequences of that is they're not reporting what's happening to them, and so we don't have visibility into what's going on. And so from a law enforcement, crime fighting perspective, there's so much going on out there that we don't have visibility into, and I think another consequence of that is this whole thing about what cyber attackers are doing to our economy. I think is wildly underreported in the media. Yes. And I think part of it is because people are being silent when they are victimized, and I personally think that in the past an individual might get blamed if they were robbed or mugged or raped or something like that. It was a shame thing, and I think as a society we've evolved past that, and we realize that just because you're a victim of a violent crime, doesn't mean you were asking for it. Doesn't mean that that you're really to blame. I think. Perhaps because we're talking about corporations that are well resourced, that changes the calculus a little, and I'm okay allowing for that. But just this whole shame, this whole atmosphere of shame, I think is counterproductive.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting discussion point, because I think the shame aspect is counterproductive except there's a lot of companies that need to feel that shame because they're doing nothing.
Well,
And
but it's private shame because they're not telling anybody, so it doesn't have the corrective, effect that public shame would.
so I think that works up until the point when you need to call reputation us, right? Because it's what happens is you're absolutely right. There are a lot of unreported cyber attacks, but at the same time, the most publicized variation is, of course, a data breach, and I'm guessing that is when reputation us comes into play, and when you've got major consumer confidence issues. But kind of going back to your core point there is that I think what I was trying to say was we have to draw a distinction between kind of meat space crime, where we victim shame in some fashion, and cyber crime, which we've talked about on this podcast before, the fundamental differences between physical type attacks and crime and the effects of technology on it, such as the ability to act remotely, the ability to automate, the ability to script and not require much human intervention. And I just think we have to start thinking of it as a different type of crime, one where the actions you take to inoculate yourself matter more than placing blame on the bad actor.
I can go along with that. So, Casey, what else did you find from your survey?
Yeah, and if I can quickly link the two, because I actually both agree with both of you on this one, because Jake, your analogy about a germ is really intriguing. I agree with you. And then obviously Kip on the other side as well, like who's to blame? So let's pretend it was a measles outbreak or a Ebola. That we want to make sure that everyone knows it's out there, highlight the awareness that there's an outbreak here. You may not necessarily be affected. You can pretend it doesn't exist, but boy, if it happens to come in your backyard and more are happening to you within your industry, within the community that you serve, and there's an issue going on, wouldn't you want to have that conversation? You can look at the measles and blame them for being measles.
Or blame a witch.
Yeah, or blame a witch, right? It doesn't exist. But the idea here is that, all right, we need to have a conversation. What do we need to do? Wash our hands, go, make sure you're checked out more frequently. Those types of conversations. That's it. I mean, and this is a epidemic, and there's no question about it. And so now, as opposed to hiding from it, just expose it, for what it is, and tackling it accordingly.
And I think too that the shame aspect will go away as more and more companies adopt, quote, reasonable security measures. There's no shame in getting sick if you've done everything you reasonably can do. There's always that risk, right? Like, if you get a flu shot and then you get the flu, you don't spend weeks, in a depression over how much shame you feel because you got the flu anyway. Like, it happens. There's a percentage risk. It's never, just like cyber security, no immunization is 100% proof against a disease, particularly the flu. And so, similarly, as long as corporations are able to do what is reasonable, then there shouldn't be shame in getting hacked. And hopefully, and ultimately another, talk about epidemiology and herd immunity. The same thing is true of cybersecurity, right? If everybody is taking reasonable measures, then it makes everybody more difficult to hack, particularly when you look at supply chain compromises, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, that comes back down to eradicating polio, right? Everybody's got to be vaccinated against polio in order for it to not have a host to land on and to be eradicated.
So I think we're on to something here, gentlemen.
Well, it's the cyber hygiene metaphor taken to its extreme, but and all from one result. So maybe why don't you go ahead and take us through to the next result of your survey,
or we'll never finish.
Exactly.
We got a lot to say. Well, there's quite a bit, and I encourage anyone who's interested to look at all the results that we have. But I think a couple different points were important for us to take a look at. But we looked at different industries, the confidence level of an organization to protect private information. And the number one industry came up on consumer confidence level was the bank and credit union industry, which I found was pretty interesting because our firm has been tackling or helping banks and credit unions from the get-go on how can they mitigate against issues and reputation risks as it pertains to cybersecurity. But the consumer, according to this survey, said, hey, the banks and credit unions, I got confidence. They're going to protect us. And I think that might have been a departure from, 3-5 years ago. But right now, according to this list, they're number one. And then right behind them was the healthcare providers at 74%. And it goes on and on and on. But I thought the bank and credit unions, who have one of the most important things to people is their money, that the folks feel confident that they are protected in that arena.
I wonder why.
And you know what those two industries have in common, right? They're both heavily regulated and have had the longest period of strict rules around cybersecurity. So, gosh, it's almost like this proves in a fashion that regulation around cybersecurity works.
Well, certainly it has an effect on the perception, right? Because one of the things that I'm sitting here thinking about is, well, wait a minute. If I go out and do a Google News search on data breaches and hacking and that sort of thing, I'm going to see so many articles on banks, credit unions, and healthcare providers. And so in a way, it almost doesn't seem to match up to what's being reported in the news media. So I'm still got a little bit of a question mark over my head.
Well, I wonder if it has something to do with the types of attacks and the general baseline level of kind of blame or shame. If like we said, or not more than 5 minutes ago, there's no way to have 100% perfect cybersecurity, which means that for the reasons that were just given, they have some of the most valuable data. They're always going to be attacked constantly.
Yeah.
And so it's not reasonable to expect that there's not going to be a baseline level of attacks in the media. It's just that they're not a big deal because they're otherwise doing what they can. And perhaps that means that, there's attacks, but they don't result in anything major. There's nothing super embarrassing or damaging that comes out. And what this makes me think of is back when I was at the Attorney General's office, we had a concept that we would apply to large corporations, and we just called it kind of the complaint baseline, and or the complaint profile of a company. And when you're an Attorney General trying to do consumer protection enforcement, one of the things you're looking at is, well, what kind of complaints are we getting about this company? And the thing is that you have to understand the complaint baseline, because certain types of companies, namely telecommunications, cable providers, they always have a certain number of complaints. And so you can't just say, okay, we're going to sue whoever has 100 complaints or more each month, because those companies have 1,000 complaints each month, just as a baseline. And I think it could be similar to what you're seeing with the banks, credit unions, and healthcare providers in cyber, which is, sure, people, yes, they're getting hacked, but people otherwise feel safe because, hey, that's just the baseline level of attacks that they're going to see.
It's sort of the noise, the ambient noise.
Yep.
That's right.
What else did you find, Casey?
Well, I just thought a couple different stats here, but I'll go with one last one. But the part where if a hack does happen, the participants said 96% of 96% says corporations should publicly acknowledge an attack occurred and offer free credit monitoring for 1 year. I would think, of course, they would say that, but pretty much the majority, if not all of them, said, okay, when it happens, you're on the hook. You need to provide us further protection. And even more to that point is that they should provide free credit monitoring for 1 year, even if there's no evidence that the information was stolen. So it's not like, oops, we messed up, or oops, your information is gone. No, just in general, the consumer is asking for more and saying, you corporation should be on the hook to protect our information and our data, and do so now.
Yeah, and that is so fascinating, because it really says to me that legislation is first of all, it's already coming in from many states, but it's the regulation and the legislation is on its way, and that level of agreement on the attitude is, kind of shows why. And just to beat a dead horse a little bit more, if you think about the if you think of this as, should we be victim shaming or victim blaming? Think about this. What value is there in telling the, flu virus not to infect humans? Just don't do it.
Right.
It's useless, right? And it's just as useless as telling the Eastern European, criminal gangs and mafias, or the Russian mafia or military, etc. Just don't hack us. Please don't hack us. It's pointless, right? And so someone has got to take responsibility. And I think that your survey shows exactly who people think should be taking responsibility for this issue.
So I want to ask a question about that. That's so if we were talking about bank robberies, like somebody showing up at a bank branch with a gun saying, "Give me your dough," do you think that that the participants would still say that it's the corporation's responsibility, or would they draw law enforcement into this? Because I think law enforcement is missing from this equation here when it comes to cyber. So, Casey, was there any questions put to this to the people surveyed about the role of law enforcement? I really am curious.
The answer to that is no. See, we had to limit it to a certain amount of questions, but I do know that the FBI and obviously law enforcement have taken an important role in, as we are in the thick of things. So, for instance, if we do have an attack, we're brought in. One of the first phone calls we make, besides our insurance and our legal advice, and hopefully a reputation firm, but would be the law enforcement, because we want to report it, and we want to make sure we can learn from it, but also so mitigate against further damage. So they are a part of the equation, but was not part of this particular, but might be a good follow-up question in future surveys.
So here's how I think that's relevant to our audience. So the people who are listening, this is something that I think is important. So 96% of participants said that corporations should acknowledge an attack. And so what I think that gets to is people are in part saying that, law enforcement really isn't a major, doesn't have a major role to play in preventing this stuff and dealing with it. And so I think as a cyber risk manager, what that would tell me is that, I've got to step up here. I've got more burden on my shoulders in the case of a cyber, attack than I would in the case of a physical, gun-based attack. I don't know. That's a takeaway that I've gotten from this.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's I don't disagree with that, but I think even that is starting to shift. If you think about the kind of requirements to run active shooter drills and the way that a lot of banks have literally rebuilt physically the buildings so that there's man traps and all this stuff. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a shift from, again, it's a question of what do we have control over? And you can't control crazy, you can't control criminals, and you cannot control distant military or nation-based hacking attempts. What you can control is how you prepare, deal with, and otherwise immunize yourself against those risks. And so, it's not really surprising to me to see these results. And I do wonder, honestly, these days, what the results would be if you ask someone, who's at fault for a successful bank robbery. Be interesting.
Mm-hmm. So, Casey, I'm wondering as we wrap up the episode here in a few minutes, what should our listeners take away from this survey? What's your perspective on takeaways from what you've learned?
Sure, and it just piggybacks on what Jake was just talking about, and that's really preparation. And there is two things going on when a cyber attack happens. To fix the problem, business continuity, and figure out what happened, and take all the necessary steps. But the other part too is communications toward that problem. What do you do? How do you communicate? Who do you communicate to? Those types of things. So let's simulate this ahead of time. So now that we know that this is a real and present danger and has been for a while, and that consumers are essentially putting a lot of blame on the corporations, let's prepare for it. Why wouldn't you? And so preparing for to do your best to safeguard your company through other different means, and make sure the business is there's no more disruption, at least mitigate the best you can on the risk. But from a reputation side, what can you do? Well, have a plan in place, have a task force that's been deputized to help in the communications of that, and make sure that all the important parties are communicate to ahead of time. And then you go through the process of make sure that you are doing your best to communicate, educate, and do your best to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's our job, is to learn from these lessons. It's going to happen, but let's prepare for it on our dime, as opposed to during the fog of war and when the actual house is on fire. So let's do something about it now.
Yeah.
Okay, so preparation. I was interested to know about cyber insurance. So we've talked about cyber insurance at different times, previous episodes, and Jake and we agree that having cyber insurance is really important. Casey, from your point of view, does cyber insurance help with the reputation damage or the reputation issue? Where does that come in?
Yeah, so one of the first things when we're brought in, and we actually are brought in a lot of time from the insurance. So we're been a vetted service provider from large carriers, and they call us usually when the attack happened. And so the coverage does cover public relations or reputation management, but that's simply just taking care of the problem when the house is on fire, if you will. And so there is coverage to that end, and some of them are as large as $250,000 to $500,000 damage. So there's a lot of policies that have public relations, but again, this is during and after, where cyber doesn't typically cyber insurance typically doesn't have coverage, is the before aspect, and that meaning the planning piece, as well as mitigation and training of sorts. And that's where we're striving to make sure that's a part of the equation moving forward, not only with the insurance, but just in general companies, that this is critical, because we like to say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? If you pay a little bit of money now to make sure you're prepared for it, it really goes a long way. The larger impact here is, you're going to potentially have a huge crippling damage to your brand, your image, the competency of your products and services based off this attack. So might as well do some preparation ahead of time. So that's the whole idea.
Just gonna continue to play my role this episode and point out that is also a metaphor used in public health. Ounce of prevention, pound of cure. Right. It's just the metaphor continues to write itself.
Well, I think it's a great metaphor to help all cyber risk managers, and I also believe that governments should be looking at cyber risk as in the same way that we do a public health problem. In fact, there's even precedent for this, because highway safety also benefited greatly when the thinking about highway safety was shifted from, it's not cool to wear a seatbelt, or only weak people are concerned about automobile crashes, right? I mean, it was kind of we were thinking about it in a very different way, and then when we started thinking about it in terms of public health, it really shifted people's perspective, and it opened up all kinds of opportunities for us to do things that today, have driven traffic fatalities down a tremendous amount from where they were. I think cyber could benefit in the same way.
That's right.
Absolutely.
all kinds of different metaphors, and airplane safety. Flight attendants are prepared. When you're emergency exit row, you have your preparation ahead of time. But the flight attendants are there to prevent this from happening. Crashes are probably not going to happen, but boy, they are. But let's make sure you're prepared. Cyber attacks are the same issue.
They are, and the NTSB in the United States does something that I really would like to see us adopt in the cybersecurity space, which is whenever there is a plane crash, there is a meticulous investigation of what caused that crash, and they drive to the root cause, and they spare no expense at doing that. I've seen some articles about the reconstruction of destroyed airplanes in giant hangars, so that investigators can sift through the rubble and figure out what exactly caused this aircraft to crash, so that we can prevent future crashes. And you know what? I don't see nearly the shame around aircraft accidents as we do in cyber, and so folks are open to the idea of having this root cause analysis performed because nobody wants to see another airplane crash. So we could really benefit from adopting that model as well.
I like it.
Agreed.
Okay. All right. So any final comments as we wrap up our episode, Jake?
No, I think this has been really fascinating. I'd encourage people to check out the survey results and to plan for the reputation aspect of a cyber attack just as much as you prepare for the technical aspects.
And just to be clear, it's part of the NIST cybersecurity framework that you should have preparations for managing your reputation as you respond and recover from a breach. So so it's baked in there as well. Casey, we really appreciate you joining us today, being our guest. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the conversation. Feels like we could probably talk for another hour.
But I'm holding myself back.
That's right. Well, the website is reputationus.com, the word reputationus.com. And then if you want to learn more information about this, specifically with the cyber survey, it's reputationus.com/cybersurvey.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you for joining us today, Casey. And that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Today, we learned about the effects of cyber attacks on corporate reputation and consumer confidence with the help of our friend and public relations expert, Casey Boggs. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Remember that cyber risk management is a team sport, so include your senior decision makers, legal department, HR, and IT for full effectiveness. So, if you want to manage cyber as the dynamic business risk it has become, we can help. Find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.